Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Kiganjo Wash Process Kenya from Lippe Kaffe. And there's the container right there. And Lippe, based out of Oslo, Norway. And this is part 15 of our 24-part KaffeBox Advent Calendar series, and a first ever appearance for this coffee roaster, as we had zero familiarity with them going into this review. In fact, I hadn't even heard of this roaster before the Advent Calendar, so this should make for a fun review, as I feel like you can tell a lot about a roaster based off their wash-processed Kenyan coffee. Again, the way that this works, the notes and tasting are made with the V60. This cup right here is made with the Chemex, and I was able to find a brew guide from 2019, which was a 15.38 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 95 degrees Celsius, 203 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, in terms of roast profile for this coffee, this one definitely holds true to the term Nordic Light, as it is a very light coffee. Maybe not necessarily the lightest of all of the coffees we've had in the Advent Calendar to this point, but definitely lighter than the vast majority of which we have had. So definitely light by most metrics and standards. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. And one really nice thing about it is we can kind of compare and contrast it to yesterday's coffee, since that was also a wash processed Kenyan. And whereas that coffee started out not necessarily the brightest, it cooled down into so many bright acidic aspects and tones. This one right here was a little opposite of that, as it definitely started out a little bit more on the bright side of things. And as the cup cooled down, there was a slight increase, but not to the same dramatic extent that yesterday's coffee was. However, there were plenty of the Kenyan-like characteristics as well, as there was a fair bit of body to the cup, and then the dark berry tones were present in what was a little bit more defined and a little bit more well-rounded of a manner, as that's one of the things I took away from this coffee, especially through the V60, was it felt a little bit more defined and focused, as opposed to yesterday's coffee, which really skewed heavily in terms of the brightness and acidity. While that brightness is consistent throughout and there's that slight bit of increase on the cool down, the clarity also seems to increase with a little bit more of the cool down. So you're able to get a little bit more defined of those fruit aspects in addition to the other Kenyan-like aspects. So there is a little bit of savoriness to this that's both present in the kind of tomato sense, but in addition to that, the herbal aspect to the cup, that herbal florality that I oftentimes describe as hibiscus, that was present in this cup as well. But in addition to that, there is this slight candied fruit sense to it, and I was able to pick up what felt like a candied stone fruit. That was present in the V60 after a little bit of a cool down, but it's actually been the most defined and notable through the Chemex with that same recipe. So this has actually been my favorite cup of any of the wash processed Kenyan coffees, the standard wash processed Kenyan coffees we've had from the Advent Calendar to this point, as it felt like it just had a little bit more depth and complexity to the cup in general. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. Right, and 3 level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. We will start with the finish level 4. And while yesterday's tasting wheel was a little difficult to make, this one right here was a lot more easy, as this was a true level 4. It wasn't overbearing in any sense, and it wasn't necessarily overly long lasting, whereas yesterday's coffee was a little bit more of a 4.5, and at times was slightly higher than that. This one right here was very much that level 4 mark, so a little less of a finish than yesterday's coffee, and that's actually a little bit of a good thing. Acidity, level 4. Same thing on this. This holds true to level 4, consistent throughout. Even when it may not have been quite as bright at the warmer temperatures, it was still pretty bright and right there at that level 4 mark, as opposed to yesterday's coffee, which was on the lower side of level 4 and then shot up to the higher side, bordering on that level 5 mark. So a little less acidic than yesterday's coffee, which is another positive for me. Berry fruit, level 4, that's been really consistent with the wash processed Kenyan coffees we've had in the Advent Calendar. Definitely the most distinct, notable, and defined profile within this coffee. Very Kenyan-like, very much to be expected. Much more of those kind of darker tart berries in general. All right, then we have a bunch of level 3s. We will start with the savoriness. So this one has been the least savory as well of those 3 wash processed Kenyan coffees. There isn't quite as much of that tomato-like aspect to this coffee. Still there, just not necessarily in the same abundance as the other coffees were. Body, level 3, slightly lower body, slightly thinner. Even through the Chemex, it's slightly thinner as well. So it still very much deserves that level 3 mark. A fair bit of body, a fair bit of texture to the cup. So that kind of Kenyan juicy term that they like to use. So that works for me right there. Cleanliness, level 3. a little higher on the V60. It's on the higher side of the level 3 mark, the cleanest of those 3 wash processed Kenyan coffees. So that's another positive in this coffee's direction. I quite liked the clarity for a Kenyan coffee in this. It definitely still had a fair bit of that savoriness, that herbality to it. So that's kind of why it still remains at that level 3. And then the sweetness at a level 3. This one felt like the sweetest of those 3 coffees as well, so still remains true at that level 3 mark. Maybe the higher side, like a 3.5 sort of thing, but I like it there at that mark. Florality level 3 was the same as yesterday, not quite as defined as maybe the berry aspects in this coffee, but I felt a fair bit of it throughout. And then the citrus fruit level 3, again, that just kind of reminds me of the brightness within this coffee. It comes out in a more citric direction, so I like it there at that mark. Stone fruit may be slightly generous at that level 3 mark, but I believe yesterday's charted at the level 2, and this one had a fair bit more of it, and it was more in that candied sense, so that's why I bumped it all the way up to a level 3. Pretty decent in the Chemex, so that's why I think it could justify the level 3, especially through the Chemex. And then I think the only other thing I kind of want to discuss on this tasting wheel is the caramel, and that's mostly to the candied sense. Oftentimes I like to throw the candied aspect of a coffee into that caramel note because I feel like that's the best place it fits. That's to kind of demonstrate that this coffee did have a little bit more of a candy-like attribute to it as opposed to what was basically just fruit sweetness exclusively. Other than that, I don't think that there's too much else worth discussing in this tasting wheel. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, it was still very Kenyan-like. I feel like I've been speaking very positively about this coffee, and it was my favorite of the 3 wash-processed Kenyan coffees we've had in the Advent calendar up to this point. But even then, it still came out very Kenyan-like, and I think that there's a little bit to work with on this one. I feel like with a full bag or with some adjustments, then I might be able to get a lot of other positive things from this coffee. What really sold me on it was the fact that I was able to get a little bit more sweetness, a little bit more clarity, a little bit more of this candied-like attribute, as well as a little bit more of the stone fruit. So for those reasons, it's definitely going to be my favorite of those coffees, and now I'm definitely curious to see what the other coffee they're going to offer in the Advent calendar is. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, it still very much falls in line with the traditional Kenyan coffee lover as it has all of the Kenyan attributes. So it's acidic, it's savory, it's got the bright berries, and it does have that kind of interesting herbal component to it as well. So all of those factors do lend itself to the more traditional Kenyan coffee drinker. With that being said, I felt that there was a little bit more depth and complexity just in general to this cup. So all of those things with what felt like a really nice positive stone fruit attribute in this coffee was another positive experience. So that's just kind of the best way I can direct somebody for this coffee. But for the most part, I think I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, we'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a review of the Kiganjo Wash Process Kenya from Lippe Kaffe. Thank you for watching.